200 years ago, this land was nothing more than a damp stretch of marshland, swampy ground wedged between open fields and a slow, winding river. No monuments, no marble, no power. And yet today, every child on earth recognizes this address without being told its name. This is the White House. At first glance, its story sounds grand. America's most famous mansion, the symbolic heart of the world's most powerful nation, a place of ceremony, prestige, and history. But behind the bright white facade lies a far more complicated truth. This house was not built by presidents. It was built by stonemasons whose hands shaped its walls, by enslaved laborers whose names were never recorded, and by immigrants who vanished into history once the work was done. Their sweat is set into the stone, even if their stories were erased. The building has endured fire, reduced to blackened brick when British troops burned it during the War of 1812. It absorbed the quiet dread of Abraham Lincoln's sleepless nights as the Civil War tore the nation apart. It listened as hushed voices spoke during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a single decision could have ignited nuclear war and ended civilization as we know it. Within these rooms, kings were welcomed and dictators tolerated. Wars were authorized. Lives were saved or sacrificed. In official photographs, we see smiles, chandeliers, and ceremonial carpets, but beneath them lie compromises, fear, ambition, and choices that reshaped the fate of millions. So what is the White House, really? Is it merely a beautiful residence for presidents, or a silent witness to America's darkest moments? Before we can understand the building itself, we must first understand why anyone chose to place America's capital here, on land that seemed by every practical measure completely unsuitable. The answer, as with so much of early American history, is compromise. In the summer of 1790, the future of the nation's capital was decided not through public debate or visionary planning, but across a private dinner table. The moment would later become legendary, a reminder that the United States was forged not just by ideals, but by political bargaining. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and controversial Secretary of the Treasury, was fighting for survival of his economic program. His proposal that the federal government assume the massive Revolutionary War debts of individual states had stalled Congress entirely. Southern representatives viewed it as a Northern power grab, one that would strengthen bankers and merchants at their expense. Enter Thomas Jefferson. Recently returned from France to serve as Secretary of State, Jefferson found himself cast as an unlikely mediator. At a private dinner in his New York residence on Maiden Lane, he brought together Hamilton and James Madison, the powerful congressman from Virginia. What happened during that meal would quietly reshape American geography. Hamilton would gain the Southern votes he needed to pass his financial plan. In return, the permanent capital of the United States would be placed along the Potomac River, on land carved from Maryland and Virginia, firmly anchoring federal power in the South. It was an extraordinary concession. At the time, cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore were far more logical choices. They were established urban centers with infrastructure, commerce, and social life, what people of the era considered civilization. The Potomac site, by contrast, was tidal marshland, forested, unhealthy, flood-prone. In modern terms, it would be like deciding to build a national capital in a mosquito-infested floodplain hours from the nearest major city. Yet its very emptiness was the appeal. Southern elites, including George Washington himself, owned land in the region and stood to benefit from the inevitable surge in land value. At the same time, a capital built from nothing could be imagined as morally pure, untainted by the corruption and commercial excess of older cities. In the minds of its advocates, this new city would become an American Rome, broad avenues, classical architecture, a capital rising from wilderness, embodying the ideals of a young republic. On July 16, 1790, President Washington signed the Residence Act into law. A federal district, 10 miles square along the Potomac River, was designated as the permanent seat of government. Philadelphia would serve as the temporary capital while the new city took shape. What followed would be one of the most ambitious and uneasy construction projects in American history. And at its center would rise a house meant to symbolize power, unity, and permanence, even as the nation itself was still struggling to define what it truly was. George Washington was granted extraordinary authority, not only to choose the precise location of the new federal city within the designated district, but to oversee the planning and construction of its most important buildings. What followed was not simply urban design, but something far more uncertain, half city building, half wilderness conquest. It was a collision between soaring ambition and the harsh realities of mud, disease, distance, and isolation. The United States was attempting something unprecedented, constructing a capital city almost entirely from scratch in a landscape nature had never intended for imperial symbolism. And at the heart of this risky experiment would rise the President's House. Washington's challenge was not merely architectural. He was tasked with creating a capital that felt worthy of a nation that saw itself as the inheritor of classical republican virtue, disciplined, dignified, and enduring. For that vision, he turned to a man whose imagination matched the scale of the task. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant was a French-born military engineer who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War. When L'Enfant arrived at the Potomac site in March of 1791, he encountered a waterlogged, uneven terrain. To most observers, it was an inhospitable expanse of standing water, dense forest, and relentless mosquitoes. To L'Enfant, it was opportunity. Where others saw limitations, he saw possibility. L'Enfant imagined a city of sweeping boulevards and dramatic vistas. The plan he presented to Washington later that summer was audacious, designed not for the fragile republic that existed at the moment, but for the powerful nation he believed America might one day become. It was a plan built on confidence, ambition, and faith in the future. At its core was a strict grid of streets overlaid with bold diagonal avenues radiating outward from key points, creating long sightlines and grand perspectives reminiscent of Versailles and Baroque Rome. This was architecture as political statement, order, symmetry, and clarity imposed upon wilderness. L'Enfant identified two natural elevations in the landscape as the symbolic anchors of the new republic. One was Jenkins Hill. There he placed the Congress House, what we now call the Capitol. The other lay roughly a mile and a half to the northwest. That rise, he declared, would host the President's House. These two structures, L'Enfant insisted, must face one another across a broad public mall. The uninterrupted visual connection between them would symbolize the balance of power between the legislative and executive branches. Government, quite literally, would be built into the landscape. In L'Enfant's vision, the President's House was to be nothing short of palatial. He imagined a residence nearly 5 times larger than the structure that was eventually built, a sprawling complex designed for state ceremonies, public receptions, and the daily operations of a growing nation. Perched high on its hill, it would command views of the Potomac River and the avenues converging upon it. From this elevated position, the chief magistrate could, at least symbolically, survey the city and the country entrusted to his temporary care. But embedded within L'Enfant's brilliance were the seeds of his downfall. He proved unwilling to compromise. He clashed repeatedly with the commissioners appointed to oversee the city's development. He insisted on the removal of any existing structures that interfered with his avenues, regardless of ownership or political consequence. Those tensions escalated until L'Enfant ordered the demolition of a manor house belonging to Daniel Carroll, the nephew of one of the most powerful commissioners, without proper authorization. That single act pushed the project past its breaking point. By February of 1792, less than a year after presenting his grand design, Lafont was dismissed. Yet his vision did not die with his departure. The commissioners retained the essential framework of his plan, the diagonal avenues, the placement of the major federal buildings, the symbolic geometry of power, while stripping away its most extravagant elements. Nowhere was this revision more apparent than in the president's house. The residence would need to be impressive but restrained, grand enough to project dignity, yet modest enough to avoid even the suggestion of monarchy. That tension between Republican simplicity and national grandeur would define every major decision that followed. At this critical moment, the commissioners made a choice that would shape the character of the building forever. They announced a public competition for the design of the president's house. In March of 1792, newspapers across the states carried the call. Architects and builders were invited to submit proposals for a residence capable of housing the president, his family, and a suitable number of servants. The reward was set at $500, or a medal of equal value, a substantial sum, though hardly adequate compensation for designing the executive mansion of a new republic. The submissions that followed were a fascinating mix. Some were practical, others wildly imaginative. Many were submitted by men whose names have since vanished from the historical record. Among them was one anonymous design, later believed to have been drawn by Thomas Jefferson himself. From this unlikely collection of ideas, the future White House would begin to take shape. From that pile of drawings and ambitions, one plan would eventually emerge, a design that would fix the architectural image of the American presidency for centuries to come. Not in any way the competitors or even the commissioners themselves could fully foresee at the time. The proposals that arrived through the spring and summer of 1792 revealed something deeply revealing about the young nation. Each drawing was more than an architectural concept, it was a political argument, a statement about power, about restraint, about how Americans believed their president should live in a country born from rebellion against kings. The commissioner's brief was deliberately imprecise, and almost certainly so by design. The president's house was to be commodious, large enough to host official receptions and conduct the business of state. Beyond that, the designers were left to interpret the meaning for themselves. There were no exact dimensions, no rigid stylistic rules. The building was expected to convey dignity without slipping into ostentation, authority without the trappings of royalty. That ambiguity opened the door to radically different visions of executive power. Some submissions leaned heavily on European palace traditions. They featured extended facades, multiple wings, elaborate ornamentation, and vast ceremonial halls, structures that would not have looked out of place among the courts of Europe. But these designs immediately raised alarms. The commissioners were acutely aware of public suspicion that the federal government already resembled a monarchy in disguise. Anything that smelled too much like a royal palace risked confirming the very fears the revolution had been fought to escape. Other entries swung sharply in the opposite direction. These designs were modest to the point of austerity, plain, compact structures that might easily have served as the townhouse of a successful merchant. Sensible, practical, and economical, yet wholly inadequate for receiving foreign ambassadors or hosting formal state occasions. Such buildings failed to project the authority of a national government on the world stage. One proposal, however, stood apart. It arrived anonymously, signed only with the letter A. The design depicted a sprawling villa-like structure inspired by the Italian Renaissance, clearly drawing from the work of Andrea Palladio. A central rotunda anchored the composition, with symmetrical wings extending outward in perfect balance. It was elegant, disciplined, and unmistakably the work of someone with genuine architectural education. Later scholarship would reveal the truth. The anonymous designer was Thomas Jefferson himself. Despite serving as Secretary of State, Jefferson could not resist offering his own vision of what the president's house should be. The design reflected everything he admired about classical architecture: proportion, harmony, and intellectual restraint. Yet for all its refinement, it carried a fatal flaw in the eyes of the commissioners. It felt too European. Too aristocratic, too close to the grand country houses Jefferson had admired during his years in France. Worse still, the commissioners almost certainly recognized his hand. Jefferson's devotion to Palladian architecture was widely known. Accepting his design would appear as favoritism toward a powerful cabinet member. Rejecting it openly risked political embarrassment. The simplest solution was silence. Jefferson's plan was quietly set aside. Many of the remaining submissions exposed the limits of American architectural culture at the time. The young republic had few architects in the European sense of the word. Most builders learned through apprenticeship and experience, not formal study of classical principles. As a result, many designs were solid and functional, but lacked refinement, proportion, and visual authority. What the commissioners were truly searching for, even if they struggled to articulate it, was a design that could thread an almost impossibly narrow needle. The president's house needed to command respect from foreign powers accustomed to dealing with kings and palaces, while reassuring American citizens that their leader remained a fellow citizen, not a monarch in waiting. It had to echo classical Republican ideals, Rome rather than Versailles, while still functioning as a working residence for both state business and private family life. In short, the building had to embody the central paradox of American executive power: strong but limited, dignified yet democratic, permanent but never dynastic. As summer gave way to autumn in 1792, frustration grew. The commissioners reviewed submission after submission, finding fragments of the vision they wanted, but never the whole. The deadline passed. Still, no clear winner emerged. It began to appear that the competition itself might fail. The commissioners faced an uncomfortable choice: extend the call for designs or abandon the public process entirely and hire someone directly. Either option risked delay, controversy, or political criticism. Then, at the moment of greatest uncertainty, a new proposal arrived. It did not come from Philadelphia or New York, not from a famous architect or a well-connected elite. It arrived instead from Charleston, South Carolina, submitted by an Irish-born immigrant builder. His name was James Hoban. Calm, balanced, and restrained, Hoban's design did something none of the others had managed. It reconciled ambition with humility, authority with restraint, classical dignity with Republican simplicity. In doing so, it would define the physical image of the American presidency not for a generation, but for more than 200 years. The man whose design would ultimately define the most famous address in America began life as far from presidential grandeur as one could imagine. James Hoban was born around 1755 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, in the rural townland of Callan, a landscape of tenant farms, stone cottages, and narrow footpaths. It was a place of hard labor and limited opportunity, especially for a young man without wealth or a powerful family name. In mid-18th century Ireland, social mobility was tightly constrained. For Catholics living under the penal laws, the barriers were even higher, restricting property ownership, professional advancement, and participation in public life. Yet Hoban possessed two things that mattered deeply in a changing world: skill and ambition. As a teenager, he apprenticed to a builder, learning masonry and carpentry by hand, while also developing the more refined discipline of architectural drawing. His talent did not go unnoticed. With the support of patrons, he earned admission to the Dublin Society's drawing school, where promising students studied perspective, proportion, and the classical orders that defined Georgian architecture. It was during these years in Dublin that Hoban encountered a building that would leave a lasting impression. Leinster House, the grand townhouse of the Duke of Leinster, stood as a model of Georgian restraint. Completed in 1748 by designs to Richard Castle's, it was composed with precise symmetry, calm proportions, and controlled classical detail. Solid stone, balanced lines, authority without excess. It projected power but avoided the theatrical ornament of Baroque palaces. For Hoban, Leinster House offered something rare, an architecture that conveyed permanence and dignity without tipping into royal spectacle. It was, in many ways, a blueprint for how power could be expressed without crowns. After the American Revolution, Ireland experienced a wave of emigration, and skilled craftsmen were in high demand in the new United States. Hoban crossed the Atlantic in the mid-1780s, first settling in Philadelphia before moving south to Charleston, South Carolina. There, a booming port economy fueled rapid construction, and Hoban quickly established himself as both builder and architect. By 1792, he had earned a solid reputation in Charleston, including work on the state capitol building, later destroyed by fire. He was successful, but still far from famous. Then came the announcement of the competition for the president's house. Hoban recognized the opportunity immediately. This was not simply another commission. It was a chance to define the physical image of American leadership itself. Drawing on his memories of Leinster House, he adapted its Georgian balance and classical restraint for a Republican setting. His proposal was clear and disciplined. A 3-story stone structure, counting a raised basement, a central entrance portico, evenly spaced windows marching across a symmetrical facade. The plan was essentially a refined rectangle, formal staterooms on the principal floor, private family quarters above, service spaces below. Practical, dignified, legible. Most importantly, Hoban understood something many competitors had missed: scale. Where Pierre L'Enfant imagined a residence 5 times larger and Jefferson proposed an elaborate villa, Hoban offered a building that could realistically be constructed within budget and time constraints. It was stately enough for diplomatic receptions, yet compact enough to function as a real home. It gave the presidency visible weight without overwhelming it. His design also carried a quieter advantage. It avoided bold stylistic gestures that could be read as political statements. The Georgian architectural language was already familiar in America, rooted in colonial public buildings and private homes alike. It felt stable rather than experimental, classical rather than fashionable, authoritative without being provocative. In a nation deeply divided over the nature of executive power, that architectural neutrality mattered. Hoban's proposal did not shout, it reassured. And in that moment, when the young republic needed symbols of permanence without pretension, that calm, balanced vision proved decisive. When the commissioners gathered in July of 1792 to review the final submissions, James Hoban's design stood apart, not because it was radical, but because it was right. It combined technical competence, visual clarity, and precisely the level of ambition the moment demanded. President George Washington himself took part in the final decision. He reportedly admired the plan's practicality, but also its quiet dignity. It promised a building that would command respect without provoking fear, authority without extravagance. On July 16, 1792, exactly 2 years to the day after Washington signed the Residence Act, James Hoban was formally declared the winner of the competition. He received the advertised prize of $500. Far more significant, however, was the commission itself. A little-known Irish immigrant had been entrusted with shaping the most symbolic residence in the new republic. The hardest work still lay ahead. The distance between a refined architectural drawing and a real building rising from marshy ground is not measured in inches. It is measured in thousands of hours of labor, constant shortages, weather delays, and the kind of stubborn persistence that rarely appears in official histories. Hoban now faced the task of turning calm lines on paper into stone walls rising from a muddy hillside along the Potomac River, a site that seemed determined to resist every effort made upon it. The ceremonial laying of the cornerstone took place on October 13, 1792, in a Masonic ritual led by the Lodge of Georgetown. The measured steps, symbolic tools, and formal speeches created an atmosphere of order and confidence. It was a moment designed to suggest harmony and control. In truth, they were blessing the beginning of one of the most difficult construction projects in early American history, on land barely ready to support a barn, let alone a presidential mansion. The chosen site for the president's house occupied a modest rise in the landscape. It was not the dramatic hilltop Pierre L'Enfant had once envisioned, but it was high enough to offer basic drainage and a commanding view. That slight elevation would prove essential because the surrounding ground remained persistently wet and unstable. Before a single foundation stone could be laid, the land had to be subdued.
The area was thick with trees and undergrowth. Crews spent weeks cutting timber, pulling stumps, and clearing brush. Then came grading and leveling, an exhausting process made worse by clay-heavy soil that turned into thick, adhesive mud whenever rain fell. Drainage ditches were cut to draw water away from the future basement, but these channels constantly filled, collapsed, or clogged as seasonal floods tested every improvised solution. For much of the first year, more shovels were used than chisels. The site had to be bullied into submission before it could even pretend to resemble solid ground. The workforce that assembled on this muddy rise reflected the deeply unequal world of early American labor. Hoban brought with him skilled craftsmen from Charleston, many of them Irish and Scottish stonemasons familiar with Aquia Creek sandstone, the material chosen for the exterior walls. Their specialized knowledge earned relatively high wages for the time, often $1 a day or more. Working alongside them were local laborers, drawn by the promise of steady employment and the rare opportunity to take part in a project watched by the entire nation. From the very beginning, however, the construction also relied heavily on enslaved labor. The commissioners, chronically short of funds and struggling to attract enough workers to this remote and unhealthy site, turned to the system already embedded in Virginia and Maryland society. Enslaved men were hired from nearby plantations, rented out by the year or by the season. Payment went not to the men who labored, but to the people who claimed ownership of them. Almost all of the heaviest work fell to these enslaved black men, clearing land, digging foundations, hauling stone, and carrying earth. Their labor kept costs down and progress moving. It also stamped a brutal contradiction into the very foundations of the president's house. Men denied the right to vote, denied legal personhood, denied ownership of land, and excluded from the liberties the new republic celebrated, were building the home from which laws governing their bondage would one day be signed.
The commissioners' account books carefully recorded payments made to slaveholders. The laborers themselves were often reduced to a single repeated phrase, "Negro hire." Even on paper, the individuals whose bodies made the building possible were rendered anonymous. As late 1792 slid into winter, foundation work continued. Crews excavated the basement level that would eventually house kitchens, storage, and service corridors. Foundation walls were laid in local stone, set carefully in lime mortar, built course by course. Progress was necessarily slow. Each section had to settle and harden before additional weight could safely be added above. Winter brought new obstacles. Freezing temperatures threatened to crack fresh mortar. Daylight hours shortened.
Cold winds and deep mud turned every working day into a test of endurance. Yet the work continued. By stubborn effort, through cold, water, and fatigue, the first permanent layers of the president's house began to rise, quietly embedding within them the labor, contradictions, and unresolved tensions of the nation itself. By the spring of 1793, after more than 6 months of clearing, digging, draining, and laying stone that no one would ever see, the project reached a decisive turning point. The outline of the basement was complete. The foundations were secure. The muddy rise above the Potomac River was finally ready for something visible. For the first time, the president's house could begin to rise. This marked the most demanding and public phase of the entire endeavor, the lifting of massive stone walls that would give the building its form, its weight, and its unmistakable silhouette on the American horizon for centuries to come. With warmer weather returning, attention shifted from earth to stone, from hidden labor to work that would be watched, judged, and remembered. This was the moment when James Hoban's careful lines on paper had to become reality.
The principal building material was Aquia Creek sandstone, quarried in Stafford County, Virginia, roughly 40 miles south of the future capital. The choice was a practical one. The stone was soft enough to be cut and shaped more easily than harder granite, yet durable enough for a monumental structure. Most importantly, it could travel by water. The quarries lay close to navigable inlets, allowing massive stone blocks to be loaded onto barges and floated up the Potomac River to the construction site. Without this river route, the rough dirt roads of the era would never have supported the weight and volume required for a building of such ambition. Each stone's journey, from raw rock face to finished wall, passed through many hands and multiple stages of danger. At the quarries, workers, again a mix of free laborers and enslaved men hired from nearby plantations, used hammers, iron wedges, and bars to split the stone along its natural grain. Rough blocks, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were broken free and maneuvered into position. Wooden cranes, levers, and sheer physical force were used to load them onto barges. Every lift carried risk. A snapped rope or shifting block could crush a man in an instant. The river journey north could take days, depending on wind, tide, and current. By the time the barges reached the wharves at Georgetown, many blocks bore chipped edges or fine cracks. Before a single stone could be laid into a presidential wall, it required further work, trimming, squaring, and sometimes cutting away damaged sections entirely. Every flawed block meant lost time, wasted labor, and renewed strain on already tight resources. Once the stone reached the building site, its true transformation began.
Skilled stonemasons, many of them Irish and Scottish craftsmen trained in Georgian traditions, took over with chisels, mallets, and years of experience behind every strike. They shaped rough blocks into ashlar, clean, rectangular stones that would give the president's house its calm, ordered appearance. Each piece required hours of careful labor, cutting away excess, sharpening corners, checking measurements, and refining the visible face until it aligned precisely with Hoban's drawings. There was little margin for error. A stone cut too thin or too short could not be repaired. It was discarded, along with all the effort already invested. At the same time, other crews worked on the invisible substance that would hold the structure together, lime mortar. Producing it was an arduous process. Limestone was burned in kilns at high heat for days, then carefully slaked with water to create a workable paste. The proportions had to be exact. Too much lime, and the mortar would shrink and crack as it dried. Too little, and it would never gain the strength needed to support heavy stone walls. Masons mixed lime, sand, and water just before use, knowing the mortar would begin to set within hours and could not be saved for the next day. The walls rose slowly, deliberately.
Course by course, ashlar stones were laid in horizontal rows, each layer needing to sit perfectly level before the next could be added. Plumb lines in spirit levels guided the work. Every mason understood that even minor errors at the base would multiply as the walls climbed higher, threatening the stability of everything above. Wooden scaffolding crept upward alongside the stone, lashed together with rope and constantly adjusted. Stones were hauled up ramps or lifted with block and tackle, guided into place by shouted commands and steady hands. The labor demanded both precision and brute strength. The work did not stop for weather, it bent under it. Summer along the Potomac brought suffocating heat, swarms of insects, and blinding glare reflecting off pale stone. Winter delivered freezing winds that numbed fingers and endangered fresh mortar if temperatures dropped too quickly. Every season tested the endurance of the men on site.
Progress depended on more than weather alone. Funding delays slowed the purchase of materials. Shortages of skilled labor forced constant reshuffling of tasks. By modern standards, the pace was agonizingly slow. Weeks of effort might raise the walls only a few feet. Yet inch by inch, the structure emerged. Gradually, the building's Georgian proportions became visible against the sky. Straight lines replaced earth, stone replaced mud. What had once existed only as a drawing now cast shadows, caught sunlight, and announced its presence on the landscape. The president's house was no longer an idea. It was becoming a reality, shaped by river, stone, labor, and time. The south facade took shape first. Regular openings were left for future windows, and a broad central section was reserved for the portico that would one day define the building's public face. What had once been a rough rise above a boggy riverbank now offered visible proof that the promises sketched on parchment in Philadelphia were being translated into stone. Every inch of that progress, every block set, every joint filled, depended entirely on human hands. To understand what the president's house truly cost, beyond money and political compromise, we have to look closely at those hands and at the very different lives of the men whose labor forced these walls upward. The workforce that raised the president's house out of the Potomac mud embodied in one crowded construction site all the contradictions of the early American Republic. On any given day in the 1790s, a clear hierarchy of labor was visible. Highly paid master craftsmen, journeymen striving to advance, and enslaved men whose wages went straight into someone else's pocket. All working together to build a house meant to symbolize democratic government. At the top stood the European-trained master craftsmen, especially stonemasons and carpenters, whose specialized knowledge could not be replaced. Many had come from Ireland, Scotland, and England, drawn by the promise of higher wages and greater opportunity than they could hope for at home. James Hoban maintained close ties to Irish building networks and recruited heavily from Charleston and other port cities where Irish workers had settled. These masters earned substantial wages for the time, often between $1 and $2 a day, along with room and board. Their names appear repeatedly in the commissioners' account books. Colin Williamson, the Scottish stonemason who oversaw much of the exterior work, Philip Hart and John Sheehan, Irish carpenters responsible for shaping the interior woodwork. Below them were journeymen and apprentices, men still learning their trade or not yet established enough to command the highest rates. They earned 50 to 75 cents a day, still a respectable income that could support a family and, over time, fund their own rise to master status. The commissioners worked hard to attract these free laborers, placing advertisements across the mid-Atlantic and emphasizing the prestige and steady pay of a project tied to the nation itself.
Even so, keeping the site fully staffed was a constant struggle. The capital's isolation, the oppressive climate, and the availability of work in older, more comfortable cities meant the president's house was always competing for hands. That persistent shortage pushed the commissioners toward a solution already familiar to Virginia and Maryland elites: enslaved labor. Increasingly, the project relied on enslaved men hired out from nearby plantations. Enslavers signed contracts renting their workers for a month, a season, or an entire year. The commissioners paid the owners. The men doing the work received nothing beyond basic food and shelter. The records describe this system in cold, bureaucratic language: payments to Charles Diggs for 5 Negro men for 1 year, money to Notley Young for hire of slaves. Plantation owners were carefully named; the workers themselves were not.
These enslaved men carried much of the heaviest, dirtiest, and most dangerous labor on the site. They quarried and hauled stone, mixed mortar, dragged materials up scaffolding, dug drainage ditches, cleared trees and stumps from stubborn ground. Some brought real skill to the work. Documents reference enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, even stonemasons. Yet even when their expertise matched that of free workers, they were typically valued at lower rates, with every cent still flowing to their enslavers. A man hauling massive stone blocks in the Washington summer, wearing thin clothing, poor shoes, and living on rations designed for economy rather than health, faced conditions that would test even modern crews with better tools and safety standards. Working side by side did not erase the divide between free and enslaved labor. It sharpened it. Some free workers resented the presence of enslaved men, arguing that slave competition depressed wages and weakened their ability to negotiate better terms. Enslavers, meanwhile, treated their workers as property even on this public stage, complaining when men were injured or fell ill and demanding compensation for damaged labor. The commissioners were left to manage constant tension, mediating disputes, answering complaints, and struggling to keep enough workers on site as men grew sick, fled, or simply refused to continue under such punishing conditions. Despite the federal government's reputation for meticulous record-keeping, enslaved workers were often nearly erased from the official documents. Free laborers appeared by full name and trade, paid to John Davis for mason work. Enslaved men appeared as categories: Negro hire, slave labor, or at best, a single first name attached to an enslaver's account. Years of back-breaking work on the president's house could be reduced to one bland line item. Their bodies transformed Hoban's drawings into stone walls, yet the bureaucracy rendered them anonymous units of cost. It would take generations before historians began the slow, careful work of pulling these figures out of the shadows, cross-checking ledgers, letters, and scattered references to recover at least some of the names and stories of the men who built America's most famous house while being denied the freedoms it was meant to represent. By the autumn of 1800, the president's house remained frustratingly unfinished, but history did not wait. Events had already decided that, complete or not, the building would soon have to welcome its first resident. The 10-year agreement that had allowed Philadelphia to serve as the nation's temporary capital had expired. The deadline was absolute. Ready or not, the federal government was required to move south, to the new city rising along the Potomac. There would be no extensions. President John Adams, nearing the end of his bitterly contested single term, now faced a strange and uncomfortable reality. He was preparing to move into a residence that was, in many respects, still a construction site. What awaited the Adams family only partially matched James Hoban's vision. The exterior walls stood firm, their Equia Creek sandstone giving the building a commanding presence atop its low hill. The roof was finally in place, at last keeping out the rain. Inside, however, the illusion of completion quickly collapsed. Only 6 rooms had been plastered and made even marginally livable. Staircases remained unfinished. The planned grand entrance on the north front lacked its portico entirely, forcing visitors to climb crude temporary wooden steps.
Outside, the grounds were chaos, stacks of timber, heaps of clay, broken stone, and rough workers' shacks scattered across the landscape. It looked less like the seat of executive power and more like an active workyard.
Still, the move could not be delayed. In early November of 1800, Adams left Philadelphia, jolting along rutted southern roads while wagons followed behind, loaded with furniture and official papers. On November 1st, he arrived at the president's house and became the first chief executive to sleep beneath its unfinished roof. His wife, Abigail, remained behind in Massachusetts for several weeks, tending to family affairs. Alone in the vast, echoing building, Adams spent his first night reflecting on the weight of the moment. He wrote to Abigail with a mixture of hope and unease, adding words that would later take on near mythic status. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. When Abigail Adams finally arrived in mid-November, her reaction was far more practical than poetic. In letters to friends and relatives, she described a daily routine defined by discomfort and constant improvisation. The house was perpetually cold. Only a handful of fireplaces had been completed, and not all of them drew properly. Firewood in the new capital was scarce and costly, turning warmth into a daily concern that demanded careful planning. Beyond the mansion's walls, there was almost nothing. Washington City consisted of scattered buildings separated by mud and clearing. With the capital itself unfinished and few shops or services within reach, even basic household tasks became logistical challenges. Abigail's most memorable adjustment involved the East Room, the largest space in the house, intended for grand receptions and formal state occasions. In reality, with bare walls and rough floors, it was useless for anything ceremonial. So she repurposed it. The room's size and ventilation made it ideal for hanging laundry. Soon, the space designed to host dignitaries and diplomats was filled with damp linens and shirts strung across makeshift lines. It is an image that lingers, the first family's bed sheets and undergarments swaying in the draft, in the very room where the young republic had imagined glittering assemblies and polished ceremonies. Inside this half-finished shell, the household staff struggled to maintain even basic routines. Water had to be hauled by hand from nearby springs. The house had no plumbing of any kind. Meals were cooked over open fires in the basement kitchen, then carried up narrow stairways to the family's rooms. With so few usable spaces, official entertaining took place in cramped, awkward settings that fell far short of what a head of state required to receive foreign envoys or congressional leaders. In many ways, the Adams presidency in the new capital unfolded amid polite chaos, the machinery of government squeezed into the reality of a building still under construction. Fortunately for the family, this uncomfortable chapter was brief. Adams lost the fiercely fought election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, his former ally turned sharp political rival. The defeat meant that Adams would live in the unfinished president's house for only about 4 months, from November 1800 to March 1801. Deeply wounded by the loss, he reportedly left Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day, returning to Massachusetts and deliberately avoiding Jefferson's swearing in. The task of transforming the president's house from a barely habitable shell into something approaching its intended dignity would fall not to Adams but to Jefferson himself. Thomas Jefferson took office in March of 1801 with strong opinions about architecture, Republican symbolism, and how a president ought to live. Where Adams had endured an unfinished house out of necessity, Jefferson saw opportunity, a chance to reshape the building and bend it toward his own ideals. Yet his years in the president's house would also expose, more clearly than almost any other presidency, the distance between American principles and American realities. Jefferson had held opinions about the president's house long before he ever carried its keys. During the original design competition, he had quietly submitted an anonymous proposal of his own, a modest Palladian villa reflecting his personal taste. Now, as president, he found himself living not in that imagined retreat, but in James Hoban's solid Georgian mansion, a structure he privately considered a little dull. What Jefferson would do next would leave a lasting mark, not just on the building itself, but on the moral compromises woven into its completion. Still, Thomas Jefferson was nothing if not practical. Rather than tear down what already stood, he chose a subtler path. He focused on strategic changes, interventions that would leave his unmistakable mark without ripping the building apart. His most important additions were the east and west terraces. Low, colonnaded wings extended outward from either side of the main block. On paper, they were modest. In reality, they solved several problems at once. The terraces concealed stables, storage rooms, and workspaces behind orderly rows of columns. They gave the president's house the classical language Jefferson believed a Republican building required, and they connected the main residence to its service areas without cluttering the grounds with scattered outbuildings. To Jefferson, these wings proved that beauty and practicality did not need to compete. They could reinforce each other. Inside the house, Jefferson turned his attention to rooms that had been barely usable during the Adams administration. He supervised the purchase and placement of furnishings, often favoring the French styles he had admired during his years as minister to France. The East Room, the vast space Abigail Adams had once used as a laundry, remained unfinished throughout his presidency. Jefferson had little interest in grand ceremonial halls. He preferred smaller, controlled environments.
Instead of rushing to complete a ballroom, he invested in the rooms where he actually lived and worked. A well-stocked library, writing rooms filled with letters, maps, and scientific instruments, dining spaces designed for intimate gatherings where conversation could replace spectacle. These dinners became one of his preferred tools of governance, quieter than speeches, but often more effective. Jefferson treated the land around the house with the same deliberate care. A passionate gardener and farmer, he envisioned the grounds as something between a working farm and a gentleman's estate, not a showpiece of ornament, but a landscape where productivity itself signaled Republican virtue. Trees were planted, gardens were laid out, vegetable plots appeared, experimental crops took root. Slowly, the muddy construction zone began to resemble a managed, purposeful landscape. Beneath this cultivated surface, however, lay a contradiction Jefferson could never fully escape. The labor that finished and refined the president's house continued to rest heavily on enslaved people. Jefferson brought enslaved men and women from Monticello to serve in the mansion as cooks, servants, and laborers. They sustained his household in Washington while the law still defined them as property. The contradiction was stark. The author of All Men Are Created Equal, presiding over a presidential home staffed, in part, by people who could be bought and sold. Construction during Jefferson's 2 terms followed the same pattern established from the beginning. The terraces he added, the landscapes he ordered, the interior spaces he refined, all relied on a mixed workforce. Free craftsmen earned wages and could, at least in theory, walk away. Enslaved workers could not. Some were highly skilled, yet payment for their labor went to their owners. Their hands made Jefferson's improvements possible, even as the system that bound them mocked the ideals the building was meant to represent. Jefferson was not blind to this tension. In his letters, he condemned slavery as a moral wrong and a threat to the Republic. In his daily life, he continued to depend on it, expanding his own holdings even as he warned of its dangers. The contradiction, subtle in his words and harsher in his actions, took physical form in the president's house itself. Here stood a structure meant to embody equality before the law, maintained by a hierarchy so unequal that some of the people who worked within its walls did not legally own their own bodies. The terraces, gardens,
and carefully arranged interiors Jefferson left behind would outlast his presidency, shaping how later presidents experienced the building. But the moral compromises embedded during his tenure would endure as well. They lingered quietly in the stone, in the service corridors, in the memories of those who labored there without choice, waiting for future generations to confront them honestly, even when that honesty threatened the comforting myths of the founding era. And now, all of this refinement, every careful decision Jefferson made, was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Not by political rivals or budget shortfalls, but by invading troops and open flame. The War of 1812, often overshadowed in American memory, had dragged on for more than 2 years without a clear victor. Then, in the summer of 1814, British strategy shifted. Napoleon had been defeated in Europe. Veteran troops were suddenly available. Britain decided to strike directly at the American capital. It was a calculated blow, meant to humiliate the young republic and force better peace terms. The President's House, symbol of American executive power, was about to become a very visible target of imperial retaliation. By August of 1814, British forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn had landed in Maryland and begun their march toward Washington. The American defense was thrown together in haste and unraveled just as quickly. On August 24, 1814, at the Battle of Bladensburg, poorly coordinated militia units collapsed under the pressure of disciplined British regulars. President James Madison, who had ridden out to observe the fighting, making him the only sitting president ever to personally witness combat, watched in disbelief as American lines broke and men fled the field.
With the defenders scattered, the road to Washington lay open. Madison raced back toward the capital and found a city already in retreat. Government officials packed trunks with papers and fled in every direction. Citizens abandoned homes and businesses, clogging the roads out of town. And inside the president's house, as the sound of approaching enemy troops grew closer, Dolly Madison was calmly directing one of the most famous rescue efforts in American history. Steady under pressure, she ordered key state documents secured. Then she turned her attention to what mattered most to her sense of the nation's identity: Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington. The massive canvas was bolted firmly to the wall in the state dining room. There was no time for careful work. Rather than unscrew the frame, servants smashed it apart and cut the painting free. It was an act of cultural triage carried out with British troops nearly at the gates. One moment in a day filled with disaster, but one that fixed Dolly Madison permanently in American memory. As the Madisons crossed the Potomac and headed west, British forces marched almost unopposed into Washington that evening. What followed at the President's House has taken on a legendary glow, but the central facts are well documented. British officers led by Admiral George Cockburn entered the mansion and found it abandoned, but not stripped. Dinner still sat laid out in the state dining room. Whether the meal had been prepared for the Madisons' possible return or simply left behind in the rush to flee remains unclear. The officers did what hungry soldiers have always done. They sat down and ate it. Seated at the American president's own table, they reportedly toasted the success of British arms while finishing his abandoned dinner. It was part practicality, part theater, a sharp, deliberate mockery of American sovereignty before the real destruction began. The goal was not looting for profit, but the systematic crippling of government power. Furniture was dragged into heaps. Books, papers, curtains, and furnishings were piled together. Fires were set throughout the building. For 14 years, the president's house had filled with wood. Floors, staircases, paneling, roof beams, perfect fuel sealed inside thick stone walls. The Aquia Creek sandstone could withstand flame, but almost everything within it could not. Once the fires caught, the interior burned fiercely.
Heat built until glass shattered, beams cracked, entire sections of floor collapsed into the basement below. That night, a violent summer thunderstorm swept across the city. Sheets of rain poured through the burning roof. Some accounts suggest the downpours saved the mansion from total destruction, dousing fires before they could reduce the structure to rubble. Even so, by dawn on August 25th, the president's house was a ruin. From the outside, the walls still stood, blackened, scorched, and fractured by heat. Inside, the building was hollow. Staircases had fallen, floors had collapsed, the roof was largely gone. Jefferson's terraces were damaged, furniture was burned, smashed, or carried off. The gardens he had carefully shaped were churned into mud beneath marching boots. The British remained in Washington for roughly 24 hours. In that time, they burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and other government buildings, then withdrew. They left behind a capital city physically devastated and a nation deeply shaken. The United States had gone to war to defend its independence. Now it had to confront the reality that its own capital had been occupied and its most powerful symbols reduced to smoking shells. Yet, even in the ashes, the story did not end. No serious voice argued that the president's house should be abandoned. The real debate was deeper and more dangerous. If the nation rebuilt, should it simply restore what had been lost, or use the destruction as an opportunity to redefine the image of the American presidency itself? In the days after the British withdrawal, with smoke still drifting from the ruins, Congress faced an even more unsettling question: should Washington remain the capital at all?
Some representatives argued that the fire had exposed a fatal mistake. The city was remote, underdeveloped, poorly defended, a swamp chosen more for political compromise than strategic sense. They urged a return to established cities like Philadelphia or New York, or even a move farther west to follow the expanding frontier. Others pushed back just as fiercely. Abandoning Washington now, they warned, would hand Britain a victory greater than anything achieved on the battlefield. Walking away from the burned capital would signal weakness, not prudence. It would suggest that the young republic lacked the resolve to stand by its own choices. That argument carried the day. The decision was made to stay. Washington would remain the capital. The president's house would be rebuilt. Once that choice was settled, another question followed almost automatically, one that would shape the building's future and the symbolism of the presidency itself. Who would be trusted to bring the house back from ruin? The answer was both practical and symbolic. James Hoban, the original architect, would be called back to resurrect his creation from the ashes. By 1814, Hoban was in his late 50s, firmly established in Washington with an extensive network of building interests. Seeing the house he had once crafted with meticulous care reduced to a gutted shell must have been a blow. Yet he accepted the commission with a mixture of professional pride and personal determination. This was not mere restoration, it was a chance to show that both the building and the young republic could rise from disaster. The first step was careful assessment. During the winter of 1814 to 1815, Hoban and his team meticulously surveyed the ruins. The sandstone walls, though blackened and weakened in places, remained largely sound, a testament to his original masonry. Jefferson's east and west terraces had survived, their damage repairable. Inside, however, nearly everything was gone. Floors, staircases, interior partitions, window frames, doors, everything that had once transformed stone into a livable home had burned. Hoban faced not repair, but near total reconstruction, a challenge almost equal to building from scratch. Congress appropriated funds, initially insufficient, later supplemented as the full scale of the work became clear. Spring 1815 saw construction resume in earnest. The workforce was familiar:
Irish and Scottish stonemasons returned to handle the masonry, American carpenters took up framing and interior finishes, and enslaved laborers, again hired from nearby Maryland and Virginia plantations, carried much of the heavy lifting. Some craftsmen who had worked on the original mansion returned, now 2 decades older, but bringing invaluable knowledge of how the house had first been assembled. In an era before blueprints could be widely copied or stored, this living memory guided the reconstruction where drawings had been lost or damaged. One of Hoban's most consequential choices concerned the exterior stone. Fire had left the Aquia Creek sandstone scarred, porous, and discolored. Some blocks were cracked, others pitted by intense heat. Complete demolition and replacement would have been both impractical and prohibitively expensive. Hoban proposed a solution both functional and symbolic: coat the entire exterior in white paint. This thick, lead-based layer sealed the stone against weather, unified the uneven, fire-marked surface, and gave the mansion a striking, consistent appearance. The change was transformative. From afar, the building now gleamed as a bright white block against the still sparse cityscape of Washington. The nickname White House, occasionally whispered even before the fire due to the pale natural sandstone, now became inevitable. Though the name would not be official until Theodore Roosevelt's presidency in 1901, the visual cue was inescapable. The mansion's identity was sealed. Inside, Hoban had the rare opportunity to refine his original design. 2 decades of use had revealed what worked and what did not. He adjusted staircases for smoother circulation, tweaked room proportions, and incorporated newer conveniences of 1815, improved heating, better windows, and enhanced interior finishes. Yet the house remained faithful to its Georgian roots. Those who had seen it before the fire would still recognize it. The building's proportions, symmetry, and dignified presence remained intact, a testament to Hoban's enduring vision.
The reconstruction unfolded with a pace driven by wounded national pride and the desire to display resilience to the world. By autumn 1817, the president's house was ready to welcome a family once again. President James Monroe and his family moved in that November, almost exactly 17 years after John Adams first crossed the threshold. The interiors were refined, circulation made practical, and the bright white exterior brought clarity and cohesion to the composition. The building now told a story. A republic might be attacked, its symbols destroyed, but it would endure. It would rebuild, and the world would see it rise again. Yet the trials of the house were far from over. The 19th century brought new pressures: technological advances, the expanding federal government, evolving social expectations, and the inevitable wear of time. The mansion transformed slowly, reflecting the growing nation and an evolving presidency, all while its white classical exterior suggested unchanging stability. Hoban himself remained closely involved. Through the 1820s and early 32s, he oversaw the final realization of aspects of his original 1792 vision. Additions and refinements gradually aligned the building with the proportions, aesthetics, and ceremonial functionality he had imagined decades before. Each adjustment reinforced the house's role as a physical emblem of the presidency: stable, dignified, and, above all, enduring. The White House that emerged from fire, flood, and decades of change carried layers of meaning. It was the product of immigrant skill, enslaved labor, free craftsmanship, and the persistence of a nation determined to define its own identity. Every whitewashed wall, every adjusted staircase, and every terrace added by Jefferson and refined by Hoban told a story not just of architecture, but of resilience, compromise, and the evolving ideals of a fledgling republic. From ruin to renewal, the building had become a symbol of continuity, a visual proof that the United States, though young and tested, could withstand destruction and emerge stronger.
Chief among Hoban's long-deferred ideas were the north and south porticos. The south portico came first, completed in 1824. It was a graceful semicircle of tall Ionic columns, curving outward to embrace the garden beyond. The structure provided shelter for ceremonial entrances while creating a stage-like facade that transformed the mansion into a public symbol. From that vantage, the president's house no longer rose simply from the mud and marsh. It commanded attention, projecting dignity and permanence across the landscaped grounds. That elegant curve, which would later anchor countless photographs, portraits, and newsreels, was a physical realization of Hoban's 1792 vision finally brought to life. The north portico followed in 1829, its character more restrained. Rectangular and functional, it faced the city and served as the main arrival point for visitors. Its straightforward design emphasized utility as much as grandeur. Together, the two porticos completed Hoban's nearly 30-year-old plan, giving the building its balanced, formal profile. Critics at the time grumbled that these additions made the president's house look too European, too palace-like for a nation that had prided itself on rejecting monarchy. Yet by the 1820s, the Republic's confidence had grown, and those anxieties no longer carried the same weight. Inside, the building never stopped evolving. Every administration left its mark: new furniture, updated fabrics, fresh paint, and paintings filling empty walls. Practical needs shifted too. The East Room, once Abigail Adams' improvised laundry space, finally assumed its intended role as a state reception hall during Andrew Jackson's administration in the 1830s. From then on, it hosted grand public gatherings, banquets, and ceremonies, at last fulfilling the vision Hoban had set in stone decades earlier. Technological changes arrived quietly but transformed daily life. Running water came in the 1830s, a modest network of pipes bringing water directly into the house. Tasks that once demanded endless labor, hauling buckets upstairs, filling basins, and tending kitchens, became manageable. Bathing, cooking, and cleaning were revolutionized, turning the mansion into a more practical, comfortable home for the first time.
By the 1840s, gas lighting began to replace flickering candles and oil lamps. Lines were threaded throughout key rooms, delicate glass shades cast a warm glow, and evenings were transformed. Yet gas coexisted with older methods. Not every space justified the expense. For decades, the soft hiss and golden light of gas defined the rhythm of White House nights, adding a subtle theatricality to dinners, councils, and quiet family hours alike. The next major leap arrived at the end of the century. In 1891, electric lighting was installed. Though parts of Washington had enjoyed electricity for a decade, wiring a house never intended for cables, switches, or outlets was a monumental challenge. Lines threaded through thick masonry, fixtures were carefully chosen, and the new system had to coexist with the older gas network. The Harrison family reportedly viewed the glowing bulbs with suspicion, sometimes leaving them burning simply to avoid interacting with the unknown technology. Yet the mansion had entered the electric age, stepping forward into the modern world, even as its residents adapted cautiously. Heating followed a similar path. Original fireplaces, romantic but inefficient, left rooms cold and drafty. Beginning in the 1850s, steam systems were gradually installed. Boilers in the basement fed hot water and steam through a network of pipes, warming radiators tucked beneath windows and along walls. Visitors would barely notice the change, yet inside, life became far more bearable during Washington's damp, frigid winters. Even as these innovations layered on, the house was slowly aging. Porticos, running water, gas lines, electrical wiring, and steam radiators were grafted onto a structure originally designed for a smaller household and simpler expectations. The president's mansion was no longer a fresh symbol of a rising nation. It had become a living, aging entity, asked to carry more people, more technology, and more symbolic weight than Hoban or any of the early designers could have imagined.
Yet through each adaptation, the building retained its dignity. Its classical proportions, its harmonious facades, and its commanding presence continued to project stability. The White House evolved with the country it represented, a tangible reflection of a republic growing more complex, technologically advanced, and socially ambitious. Every column, every pipe, every glimmer of electric light was a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the enduring vision of those who had first imagined a house worthy of a nation's chief executive. In the long arc of its early history, the mansion transformed from a practical residence, a symbolic statement, and a stage for political theater into something more, a living chronicle of American progress. Each improvement, portico, plumbing, gas, electricity, heating, was more than convenience. It was a layer of narrative, showing how a building born of mud, masonry, and ambition could carry the weight of national identity, endure the ravages of time, and remain central to the story of the United States. When the Truman family returned to the White House in 1952, they stepped into what was, in practical terms, a brand new house wearing a familiar face. From the outside, the historic white stone remained unchanged, calm and iconic. Inside, however, every room had been painstakingly rebuilt. Period paneling, ornate plasterwork, and decorative moldings preserved the look of centuries past, but beneath these surfaces lay a modern skeleton of steel and concrete, hidden plumbing, wiring, and heating systems that could finally support the demands of mid-20th century life. For the first time, the mansion could safely host large gatherings, run the latest communications equipment, and maintain comfortable year-round living for the president and family. Yet even amid the triumph of modern engineering and careful restoration, a deeper question emerged. Whose history was being preserved? Whose hands were acknowledged? And whose labor had been quietly erased from the narrative of America's most famous house? For nearly 2 centuries, official histories had focused almost exclusively on presidents, architects, and a few prominent free craftsmen. Enslaved men and women, who had labored to build, maintain, and operate the mansion, appeared at best as nameless background figures and at worst as invisible. This omission was not accidental. It reflected a conscious pattern of remembrance that celebrated symbols of national pride while looking away from the human cost embedded in them. Recovering these silenced stories became a slow, painstaking process that began in the 1970s and 1980s when historians, influenced by social history, began examining archival records with fresh eyes. The commissioner's account books from the 1790s and early 1800s, preserved in the National Archives, became a crucial resource. Page after page detailed payments to slaveholders for Negro hire, treating men and women as rented property rather than human beings. Even so, these cold ledgers proved a vital point. Enslaved labor was not incidental, it was central to the creation and functioning of the president's house from its earliest days. Turning those line items into real people, real lives, required detective work. Researchers cross-checked plantation records, letters, newspaper advertisements, census data, and any fragment of documentation that might hold a clue. A payment to Daniel Carroll for the hire of Negro Tom could be matched with plantation records identifying an enslaved carpenter named Tom. Entries noting 5 hired Negro men could be traced to specific craftsmen skilled in masonry or carpentry living in the surrounding region. Slowly, painstakingly, first names emerged. Trades, locations, and fragments of biography began to give flesh to the anonymous laborers who had once been reduced to a cost line on a page. The picture that emerged revealed the remarkable scope of enslaved contributions. These men and women had quarried and hauled stone, cut timber, fired bricks, mixed mortar, and carried out the relentless heavy work essential to any large construction project. But it was not only brute labor. Some brought extraordinary skill, rivaling that of free artisans. Enslaved carpenters, stonemasons, bricklayers, and foundry workers left craftsmanship that endures in the building itself. Figures like Philip Reed, an enslaved foundry worker who later played a pivotal role in casting the Statue of Freedom for the Capitol Dome, exemplified a wider network of highly skilled enslaved craftsmen whose expertise was indispensable, even as the law denied them basic human rights. The records also revealed the human cost behind the stone and plaster. Construction in the 1790s was hazardous for anyone, but enslaved workers faced extreme danger with no protections. Free laborers could refuse unsafe work, demand better conditions, or leave the job entirely. Enslaved men could do none of these things. They were expected to labor until injury, exhaustion, or death prevented them. Account books sometimes recorded payments to owners for workers who were disabled or killed on site, treating human loss as property damage. How many fell to collapsing scaffolds, were crushed by shifting stone, or succumbed to harsh working conditions will never be known, erased if their deaths did not affect a slaveholder's finances. The reliance on enslaved labor did not end with the last stone or the completion of scaffolding. Throughout the antebellum era, enslaved workers maintained the house itself, cooking, tending fires and lamps, gardening, stabling horses, and serving in the household. Presidents from slaveholding states brought their own enslaved attendants, layering additional human contradictions into the executive residence. Within the very home of a republic founded on liberty, human beings were bought, owned, and ordered to serve the nation's highest office. Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, and others ran the affairs of the presidency while being personally attended by people they legally considered property. A stark, ongoing tension between national ideals and lived reality. As this research filtered into public awareness, the narrative of the White House began to shift. By the 21st century, acknowledgement of these hidden histories became integral to understanding the building's full story. In 2016, Michelle Obama, speaking to the nation, explicitly reminded Americans that the White House had been built by slaves, a powerful act of public historical reckoning. The recognition of these lives, once silenced, adds depth to the grandeur of the mansion and complexity to the story of the American presidency. The walls that once concealed the labor, skill, and suffering of enslaved workers now stand as a reminder. The White House is not only a symbol of power, but a vessel of history, resilience, and the human stories that made it possible. For some, hearing that truth spoken aloud from the East Room podium was startling, even controversial. Yet it echoed what the archives had been revealing for decades. In the years that followed, official tours began to acknowledge more directly the indispensable roles of enslaved workers. Exhibits, publications, and educational materials started to place their stories alongside those of presidents, first ladies, and architects. A commemorative marker was installed, giving public recognition to the hands that helped construct the house, making visible what earlier generations had refused to see. Even now, the work of recovery is incomplete. Many names are lost forever, and countless stories can only be inferred from fragmentary records. Yet the effort is more than an academic exercise. It is a reckoning with the White House as it truly is, not merely as a symbol of American ideals of democracy and equality, but as a reflection of the long, painful gulf between those ideals and the lived realities of the people whose unpaid labor built its walls. This history invites us to ask anew, what does the White House represent in the 21st century? Not the idealized image of Republican virtue its designers imagined, but the complex, sometimes uncomfortable truth of what it embodies. The building functions as three intertwined realities, each demanding attention and each carrying its own contradictions. It is first a museum, preserving more than 2 centuries of presidential history and welcoming over 1 million visitors annually, eager to glimpse rooms where decisions of global consequence were made. It is second a working office, where the daily business of executive governance continues amid priceless antiques, computer networks, ceremonial spaces, and functional work areas. It is third a home, where a first family attempts to carve out private life under the gaze of the entire nation and the world.
Yet beyond these roles, the White House serves as a mirror, reflecting America's deepest contradictions. Its construction embodies the founding paradox of a nation proclaiming universal human rights while simultaneously practicing systemic human bondage. Designed to symbolize Republican virtue, it was raised by hands denied the very freedoms the Republic promised. This is no abstract historical irony. It is encoded in the building itself. The stones, cut, hauled, and set by enslaved men, carry the weight of labor that could be bought, sold, and exploited. Recent commemorations and acknowledgments mark essential progress toward historical honesty, but they cannot resolve the fundamental tension at the heart of the White House. We cannot retroactively grant freedom to the men and women whose sweat soaked into its foundations. We cannot unwrite the conditions under which the first stones were laid, but we can control the narrative going forward. We can choose whether to perpetuate a sanitized history focused solely on founding fathers and noble ideals, or whether we embrace the full, uncomfortable truth of how America's most iconic symbol of democracy was actually built and by whom.